Hi, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us from wherever you are in the world as we present on the findings of a global survey on the perspectives of vendors and library workers on vendor services. I'm Erin Gallagher, and I'm the Chair of Acquisitions and Collection Services at the University of Florida Libraries, and I'm located right now in swampy Gainesville, Florida. And I was particularly interested in being a part of this project and in organizing a panel because I have an ongoing professional interest in library and vendor dynamics through my role. I work very closely with our consortium here in Florida, and I just believe in the importance of strengthening the dynamics between libraries and vendors. And also, full disclosure, I started out in a vendor role right out of grad school. So that's also why this is very near and dear to my heart.
I am Jonathan Harwell. I am at Georgia College in Milledgeville, Georgia, where I'm the Associate Director for Collection and Resource Services. And I've been working in collection development in academic libraries for many years. I've also been enjoying the Charleston Conference for many years as well. And that was always in my mind when I was thinking of this survey originally, was that, that's sort of a place where the library workers, the vendors, the publishers, the consortia all come together and talk together to try to understand one another and solve problems together and think about the future together. So I'm happy we could do this.
My name is Amy Pham. I just stepped into a new role at SCELC as the Assistant Director for Strategic Library Services and Communications. SCELC stands for Statewide California Electronic Library Consortium. And while we're based in California, we actually serve over 300 libraries in 39 states. We serve academic libraries and primarily focus on licensing, which means that strong vendor partnerships are integral to the work that I do here at SCELC. I'm really excited to be here talking to Erin, Jonathan, and Shannon, because I think that whenever we have a chance to question the existing narratives and frameworks in our field, we should take that opportunity to ask ourselves, does this narrative is it still true? And do these frameworks still work for us?
Hi, I'm Shannon Spurlock, the Director of Academic and Public Libraries for Canopy, an Overdrive company. I work both with academic and public libraries for streaming film in particular. In my experience, we all learn and progress so much more by library and vendor collaboration, and Canopy learned a bit of the hard way by lack of prioritization of what libraries communicated was a need for them. And so we shift our course and spent the last few years prioritizing what libraries have communicated their needs are. And so by coming together and assess joint needs, we've been able to really achieve those joint goals. And discussing this today, adjusting what we know about the frameworks, overcoming those stereotypes are really important to me, just because it was something that was a challenge and then an opportunity with Canopy.
Wonderful. I'm really excited about our amazing panel, and we got a real crack team here together, y'all. So why did we go about doing this? What were our goals? What were we trying to pick apart here? Really, we engaged in this survey and disseminated this survey because we wanted to test long established assumptions. And these are mainly that library workers and vendors don't value the same things, and that our goals and priorities are often at odds. And as someone who has worked on both sides of the bookshelf, I can tell you that this narrative is very persistent, if not necessarily accurate. So we also wanted to fill a gap in the scholarship. There's been quite a bit written on library vendor dynamics, but it tends to relate to the legacy buyer-seller relationship. And there really hasn't been anything that explores the more human element of values and priorities across our realms. We also wanted to investigate the validity of these sort of, common narratives. And we also wanted to satisfy our own curiosity and spark further discussion and research. But most importantly, I'd say we wanted to create a foundation for stronger library vendor partnerships through our shared understanding. And so this project wasn't meant to create further rifts between vendor and library workers, but rather to dissect these very assumptions and reframe the narrative as one of collaboration and partnership. So how did we do it? Well, we disseminated a global survey, which was released on October 15th of last year, and it went all the way to February 28th of this year, which is when it closed. And all of our survey responses are meant to be individual. perceptions or views, and they're not representative of an organization or an institution. So what we were thinking was, we want to know, what do library workers value and prioritize in their vendor partnerships? And then on the flip side, what do vendors think library workers value and prioritize in their partnerships? And so we went about this by crafting a global survey using the Likert scale model. And we used that in order to gauge agreement or disagreement with a series of 22 statements. And so if you were a library worker and you took the library worker track of the survey, you were asked to respond to this series of 22 statements, and based on the things that you value and prioritize in vendor services and in your relationships with vendors. And you were given an option of responding with not a priority, low priority, medium priority, or high priority / deal breaker. If you were a vendor and you took the vendor track of the survey, you were also asked to respond to these 22 statements with your level of priority, but you were responding based on what you thought library workers valued and prioritized, not based on what your own values or priorities were as a vendor. So this is really interesting, because we're going to see where we see some, connections and disconnections here. But not only did our respondents respond to the Likert scale comments, which that format allows us to measure perceptions and opinions with more nuance than just a yes or no, but they were also given the opportunity to fill out some free text comments. So we got a little, rich responses there. All right.
You can see here the spread of responses across various types of sectors. So you've got vendor workers representing 11%, for example. You've got 3% were from consortia, and this was not a group that we intentionally targeted with the survey, but we'd like to hear more from this group in future iterations, which we'll talk about later. But this is one reason that we're so glad to have Amy joining us today with her perspective here. We also had quite a few respondents from academic libraries, also from public libraries, and a few from hybrid academic public libraries. You'll notice we did go through a validation process. So these were not completely anonymous responses, although they are being kept confidential. So we had 10% of responses omitted, either because we couldn't verify the person and couldn't guarantee it was an authentic response, or it was a duplicate response. So some were edited out because of that. And we also had 25% of people coming from beyond the US. So you can see here, it's sort of the spread of the number of items that different groups marked as each level of priority, which, as you can see at a glance, were fairly consistent across groups, which I thought was interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean they rated the same things the same way, which we'll talk about, but you can see that at least the number of responses fairly closely match across groups. So I'm wondering, Amy and Shannon, were either of you even aware of the survey before we asked you to join the panel for the presentation?
I wasn't, but I'm very happy that I got to participate more so.
Cool.
I
What about
was.
you?
And I actually had your ERNL presentation open in this persistent tab in my window for the longest time before you reached out about the panel. I'm a huge fan of breaking down barriers and establishing new ways to collaborate, especially if those barriers are ones that we put in place ourselves.
Thank you. And so I'm wondering here, why do you think this narrative that we don't share the same values and priorities across vendors and libraries, why does that persist? What do you think, Shannon?
I mean, it's a tough one, and it's a frustrating one, but there are a lot of ideas, I think, that drive this perception of libraries versus vendors, and we do things to perpetuate it. For example, there's always this idea of vendors are trying to make as much money as possible, while libraries are trying to provide as many resources as possible, but for the lowest dollar amount. And I don't believe either of those are true, because if we do collaborate with each other and break down the barriers, like Amy mentioned, there's typically solutions that meet both needs. And in some of Canopy's recent experiences, we launched a smart PDA program and a subscription option, both of which we worked with our partner libraries in collaboration to launch. We also brought on staff that had library backgrounds and library degrees to help us develop it and refine it. And now we're providing services that are much more valuable to the library in conjunction with them. They were part of the product development. They were part of the pricing and budgetary need components. So joining forces, we can actually provide much more value. But again, that perception is a lot of times what's driving us apart instead of together.
Thank you, Shannon. So I'm wondering, Amy, in your perspective, coming from a consortium, are there any experiences you remember that served up in this narrative of mismatched priorities?
I actually think the opposite. I wanted to talk a little bit about how Skelk just started working with Canopy. And I'm so glad that Shannon is frankly talking about the past reputation that Canopy had and that the approach they're taking to it now is new and collaborative, because when we started working with Canopy, there was that initial trepidation. Is this collaboration going to go well? And is Canopy's main concern still that bottom line that we all believe is what vendors are most concerned about? But as people, we were all sort of able to put aside those preconceptions and approach this new working relationship with an open mind. And I think that was really key to the success of this new relationship with Canopy. And I think for me, that was a great reminder that oftentimes we forget we're really working with other people, not just a company.
Well said. Thank you. Erin, you want to show us some of these high priorities we identified?
I do. This is where things are going to get really fun. Okay, y'all. So what you're seeing here are the top items chosen by each of our respondent group as high priorities, which is the same thing as deal breakers in the survey. And you'll notice that a lot of these are the same response, and you see them color coded, highlighted with the same colors. And so we've got response groups from consortia, academic library workers, public library workers, and vendors. And it's really interesting because you notice that we've got a lot of the same statements. There aren't a lot of really huge, massive disconnects among the statements that we're seeing, the top priorities listed here. But I'm just interested, kind of quick gut check, Amy and Shannon, when you saw this, based on your experience, were there any immediate surprises?
I think for me, it was clear access and product knowledge rates highly, which made sense. I was surprised how different academic and public library responses were. While working with both and knowing how different they are, it was just, that added validation that their top priorities, their top deal breakers are not the same.
I was really surprised to see that consortia valued willingness to negotiate pricing and licensing terms higher than academic libraries did, because that's what I'm thinking about all day, every day. And I think when I really thought about it, though, it makes a certain amount of sense, because the nature of consortial work really means that we have to provide the most benefit to the most libraries, where a library's priority might be to provide access to a resource. A consortium's priority is to make sure that library can afford to provide access to that resource.
That's such a good point. And Amy, honestly, that was a big surprise to me too, because I'm not a consortial representative, but I'm like living in this world of license negotiation and pricing all the time. And I honestly thought that this was going to be, match up as a higher priority among academic libraries as well. But I think you make a really good point there. Another thing that I noticed that I thought was interesting, we almost have a connect four with a library vendor must be trustworthy. We're heading up here and then it just kind of, changes a little bit up in the vendor side. But this was really interesting to me, that the statement, a library vendor must be trustworthy. It is a high priority among all four groups, but it tracks as a higher priority for vendor respondents in guessing that that's what libraries prioritize. And it's a bit lower, especially for consortia and academic library respondents, as a top priority that they prioritize. So I'm very interested, Amy and Shannon, in why you think this is. Why is there that disconnect there between the vendor response and the academic and consortia libraries?
I'm happy to go first. For me, I think it's on the vendor side, we hear regularly from our library partners that a strong relationship is necessary. It's something that can drive confidence in trying a new product and spending year-end funds. And if there is a distrust or there is a challenge, we'll be the first to hear about it. We'll be the first to learn how that could make our ongoing relationship problematic. And so because we hear day in and day out about this, it's top of mind, and perhaps it's, you know, less top of mind in reality for the partners themselves. But I mean, it's one that I think we have to keep top of mind as if it's number one, because being trustworthy is so important.
That's a really excellent point. I like that, keeping that top of mind, definitely.
Yes, and I want to encourage you to keep thinking that way, because even though here it shows that maybe we prioritize it a little bit less, I want us to want to prioritize it higher. I think it's important that we're able to trust the people we work with.
Absolutely. And I think too that, you know, if I were to kind of suss this out a little bit more, I would say that trustworthy is a tough word to interpret. I think it's going to be interpreted differently, perhaps among different respondents, and that sometimes it's equated with, you know, honesty as well. And honesty is a hard thing to take. Honesty and transparency are a bit hard to take sometimes in the vendor library relationship, because sometimes you have to hear hard truths or face hard facts. And I will say that I would guess that most of us on that library worker side would say that we would value trustworthy. We want the hard facts. We want the hard truth. We can handle it. And we just appreciate that, you know, honest relationship. So something else that was interesting that you're not actually seeing here, but was part of the open comments of the survey, we had several respondents emphasize that their libraries prioritize certain elements of vendor products, such as a really great user experience in the interface and very accessible products. So I'm interested, both Amy and Shannon, in your thoughts on how can libraries best communicate these needs to vendors? And then even on the flip side, how can vendors communicate their challenges and their needs to libraries?
I mean, for us, it's helpful to know what's needed as early as possible and as detailed as possible, so we can do our best to prepare or accommodate, especially if it's a high priority and or deal breaker, because we're always going to be working on a large number of items and we need to get it on our roadmap. We need to be preparing for it. And I think to your point, it goes the opposite way as well, where we need to be communicating with you what we're working on. So if we can't do something right away, you know why, and you know the background for it. So more communication more often, not just about what we're doing that day, but what our product roadmap looks like as well.
That's great.
I agree with Shannon here that the communication needs to happen both ways. I'm always encouraging our libraries to speak directly to their vendor rep. I think that consortia sit in this kind of odd spot between libraries and vendors, where we hear things sometimes that our vendor partners don't. And that's not helpful for anyone, because our vendor partners are the ones creating the products and our libraries are the ones using it. And then on the flip side, I want to encourage vendors as well to be open. And I think, as Erin was saying earlier, to be honest, even if it's a hard honesty. If you can't provide the pricing that we want or the service that we're looking for, just, you know, tell us why. It might not be a pretty answer, but at least we'll know. And I think that will go a long way in terms of not villainizing the vendor.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Thanks, y'all. Lastly, I'm just interested, any hot takes on other areas of high priority or deal breakers that you've experienced that aren't represented in the survey responses?
I think they're kind of weaved through, but price fairness. So we talk a lot about negotiations, but what about the actual price that the vendor enters the market with? Really important that it's fair. And then quality of content. So not just quantity, not just filler, but really providing that quality content that the library, faculty, students, etc. are looking for, I think are two things that have been communicated to us as high priority as well.
I want to +1 to both of those. I would love to see those added as priorities and recognized directly in that way. And at least from the consortial side, what I'm hearing from member libraries is a focus on accessibility and a prioritization of DEI initiatives. I would also love to see more consortial responses to this. I think something that's missing a little bit for me is that you'll hear this a lot from consortia, that every consortium is a different consortium. And so I wonder how much of our priorities in the consortial world differ as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Amy, because as you notice, when you see the 100% on the top left, that's all the consortium. That was only 12 respondents. So it's very hard to generalize with this number of respondents, but we're so glad to get all the comments that came in as well.
So we've been checking out the top of the top here, but now it's time to move on to our top not a priorities.
Yes, the flip side. So these are the ones that were identified as not a priority. So they're the bottom 5 for each group, if you will. And you'll notice these colors and barely match across the board, maybe with one exception. But for the most part, people were identifying the same themes as not a priority for libraries. Again, that's the question, right? How do vendors see the librarians' priorities, for example? So you'll see some things floating to the top or the bottom, if you will, like meals, for example. So meals at conferences. Is this something that we're leaving behind in the post-2020 world, or what do you guys think? Shannon, any thoughts on this?
I hope not. While, I don't see the same sort of value for large meals or maybe big events, having those vendor dinners, having those vendor lunches is something our team misses. It's something I miss. You can't make the same personal connection over Zoom. We are all human. Amy mentioned that before. It's nice to get that human connection with our partners, and really those meals were the only kind of special time where you weren't talking about the product. You weren't trying to find a solution to maybe a problem that was occurring. And so I hope they come back. It feels like they're coming back, especially with the Charleston conference. So I wouldn't say that it's a bygone.
Thank you. Another thing we notice in sort of the peach color here is about customer satisfaction and how that's measured by vendors. We had a couple of comments come in about this. For example, one person said, I expect to be able to report dissatisfaction with customer service if an issue comes up and have it addressed, but I don't need to be surveyed every time I interact with a vendor rep. Another person said, customer satisfaction inquiries on every single transaction drive me nuts. What do you guys think about this? Amy, what do you think?
So I think one of the running themes here is the idea of that human connection. And I actually personally find these help ticket customer satisfaction surveys to be very dehumanizing and a little disconnecting. And what I would rather get instead of a customer satisfaction survey is a direct follow-up from our vendor rep. I want to hear directly from someone and know that there were eyes on my problem, and to have them ask me, was your issue resolved, and was it resolved to your satisfaction?
Thank you. Excellent. Any other thoughts on these from anyone?
Well, I will just make one comment about the meals, which is just to echo and reinforce Shannon's sentiments there, because in my old vendor days, it really was kind of a different animal. There were these really huge dinners where you'd have 25 people at a long table. And it, as someone coming straight out of grad school, it was very sumptuous and exciting for me in some ways, but at the same time, you end up, talking to the person next to you, and that's pretty much it. Whereas I really like the trend now toward a smaller group setting, smaller group conversations. And you're absolutely right. You get to know each other as humans. And there is something that has been lost, I think, in particular in the last couple of years of, we're on a Zoom call to check in about our account, and we just kind of get straight down to business. And there isn't as much of that off the cuff conversation about our pets and kids and lives and travel and what's going on. And those are the things that then lead, I firmly believe, to that culture of trustworthiness and that expectation of a fruitful relationship. I didn't want to step on anyone else who was about to comment there, though.
No, I agree. So we're all going to dinner at Charleston is our takeaway from that. I'd also say, just in terms of the customer support and satisfaction tickets, this is something that we do. it is part of the ticketing system. It's really helpful and eye-opening to even have this feedback. I mean, we want people to be able to take things away from this. That's something I'll be taking away to our team, and just sharing, ticketing systems like this don't provide that personal connection and could be harmful as opposed to helpful. So I really appreciate that as well.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. You want to talk about future directions for this study, Erin?
I do, and I love how fruitful our presentation is. We're like solving all the problems in this 30 minutes, y'all. So the beauty of our research, of course, is that it never truly ends. And we've already identified some areas for improvement or expansion. And some of these ideas, by the way, came from the open text comments that we got from the survey and were echoed by Amy and Shannon, throughout our conversation. So thank you to folks who took the time to send in these open text comments on the survey, because in the future, we would love to explore some statements around DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, around user data confidentiality, and around accessibility in particular. And we'd also, after seeing the overwhelming response from consortial reps on this survey, we would really love to have a version or a track specifically for consortia. That would be really fascinating. And we heard you. There were several comments letting us know that you perhaps would have responded differently if we had created separate categories for high priority and deal breaker. And so definitely duly noted. We would consider possibly repeating the survey in 5 years and, taking all of these comments and crafting it into something even more comprehensive. But then also stay tuned, because there will be a full research article coming out from this. And yeah, Jonathan and I are going to be cracking on that and hope to have that published in some sort of open access or openly accessible publication very soon. But one thing last question that I'm interested in. So Amy, Shannon, or Jonathan, do you anticipate making any changes either on a personal or organizational level based on the results we've discussed today? And Shannon, you kind of started touching on this already.
Yeah, other than the customer satisfaction score, that's always a bit of a tongue twister. I think also just trying to have this conversation more, whether it be at dinners or lunches, time where we're not trying to just get through a program review or a product review, but really breaking down these barriers and opening these conversations up across the board, because we don't spend a lot of time on this topic, and I think we need to more. One thing I think would also be interesting just in terms of future directions is understanding from the respondents, have they been in the industry a long time, and are they perpetuating an idea they've learned before, or have they just joined the industry and maybe fresher ideas are being changed? I'm not sure if that's something we looked at, but I think as a way to understand how this preconceived ideas are continuing to form, or are we actually making progress in breaking barriers down?
Awesome. And also, by the way, spoiler alert, we do have data on a length of time in the profession. So that's going to be part of the article.
Great.
I think Shannon made such an interesting point there, that part of what we need to be doing after this is continuing those conversations. And I'm certainly excited to continue this conversation with our member libraries and with other consortia.
Wonderful. Well, we so appreciate and just thank everyone. Thank you to Amy and Shannon, of course, for being on our panel. I also want to give special thanks to Josh Garcia at Canopy for being our wonderful slide wizard and creator. He was really amazing and came through for us. But also just thanks to everyone who responded to our survey, because you're helping to build out this project and helping us to make it better. So thanks for joining us. We're very much looking forward to the live Q&A in just a moment, but you can always contact us directly if you have any questions or comments. So enjoy the rest of the conference, y'all.